Good afternoon, everybody. As was shared, I'm Bassam Ishak from Syria. I'm an opposition figure. I have been in opposition at heart for 4 decades now in Syria, and I officially joined the opposition, Syrian opposition, in 2004. Working through the Syrian Human Rights Organization in Syria. I became also involved in the Syrian political scene in 2003 first, when I ran for parliament in the northeast region of Hasakeh. You see that on the map, on the northeast. The Hasakeh region is bordered on the north by Turkey and on the east by Iraq. It's closer to Kurdistan, Iraq, and it's a pluralistic culture there. We have a Kurdish population, a tribal Arab population, and Syriac Christian population. And I am myself, I'm Syriac Christian. My family came down from Turkey, from southeast Turkey, where many of the Syriacs, after 1915, a massacre in Turkey of Armenians and Syriacs, fled into Syria. At the time, the borderline was not established yet. It was later established by the French, who came to rule Syria in 1920. And so you have, in the northeast of Syria, we had a unique experience, pluralistic society, and it's a prototype of the rest of Syria, where you have it's a very diverse country, religious-wise and ethnic-wise, and even ideological-wise. So Syria has been struggling for, I think, political identity since the 1920s, when after it was freed from the Ottoman Empire in 1918, with the Arab army coming from with King Faisal, who was at the time Prince Faisal, and then he became king of Syria, and Syria was struggling with identity. Before 1920, the common identity for Syria, which included at that time Lebanon and Palestine, was the salient identity was the Islamic identity. This is how the Ottoman ruled, the Arab world, through the common identity between them and the Arabs, which was the Islamic identity. After, French came to occupy Syria and established a separate country, divided Lebanon from Syria, and Palestine was, also divided out of Syria. It was a struggle of identity that continues to this very day. And this is what Bashar al-Assad is trying to utilize on the sectarian identity to have support for his regime. I don't believe he really cares for his sectarian identity. It's just a tool that he uses. So throughout 20s, 30s, Syrian people were struggling together. Muslims, Christians, Arab, Kurds, Syriacs were struggling for independence from France that unified the country. And in 1946, Syria became independent, and it had a democratic government. The president was elected through the parliament. It was a parliamentarian system, and all groups were represented in that parliament. But that era was short-lived. In 1949, we started having coup d'etats. The military started to interfere, and foreign powers were really vying for influence in Syria, because it had a very strategic location. So in 1949, after three coup attempts, eventually General Adib Shishakli, who's a Muslim Sunni, took over. But in 1954, he was overthrown, and a civilian government, democratic government, came to power in 1954. But it was short-lived. The majority of the people really wanted to unify. They were not happy with the Syrian identity, which was, 26 years old at that time, 30 years old. They really saw themselves as part of unified Arab, nation. So this was that put a pressure on Shikri al-Quwatli, who was the president, and signed the Unity Pact with Nasser of Egypt in 1958. However, Nasser brought in a very oppressive regime, dominated, Syria, and Syrian people started to say, we shouldn't have given up our democracy for our, ultra-nationalist aspiration. This brought in 1961 a coup that separated Syria from Egypt, and again, civilian government came back in 61. We had an elected president, but it was short-lived. 2 years later, in 1963, in March 8th, 1963, the Socialist Ba'athist Party, staged a coup d'etat and took power. And on March 8th, 1963, they announced the executive powers. It was emergency law installed in 1963, which was removed after the revolution, in recent revolution in 2011. So Syria has been ruled since then by emergency law through a dictatorship. There was a struggle from 1963 to 1971 among the Ba'athists who ruled Syria. Eventually, Hafiz al-Assad, from the military, staged the coup in 1971, and he became the dictator of Syria. It seemed like he was bringing stability to Syria. 1973, he attempted, to make changes. He proposed to make changes, Hafiz al-Assad, to the Syrian constitution. And he wanted to remove a clause in the constitution that specified that the religion of the president is Islam. And that started demonstrations in Syria against him. So this is why many Christians in Syria are sympathetic to the Syrian regime. So that started the demonstration in 1973 against Hafiz al-Assad. They said that he was an atheist and led an atheist government. Hafiz al-Assad, retracted his proposal. And we recently, after the revolution started, his son Bashar al-Assad, in a speech to the Muslim Sunni clerics in Damascus, said that he will not come under Western pressure to change Article 3 in the Constitution that specify that the religion of the president is Islam. Which makes, this article makes non-Muslim Syrians, Christians in specific, feel like they are second-class citizens in the country where they are the indigenous people. So this is an issue that still lingers. And recently, after the revolution started in 2011, Bashar al-Assad, in order to appease the pro-democracy movement, proposed a new constitution. They put the draft into referendum, and it still had the Article 3 in it. And the Christians of Syria who support Bashar al-Assad didn't go out and vote for the new constitution. So it didn't get the usual 99% vote, it got 89% vote. But these are some of the issues, the history background about Syria. I'm going to try to give you in this talk more my personal inputs into it and personal experience, because you could read about lots of this on your own, on the internet. So I myself am, as I said, from the province of Hasakeh. My family came from Turkey in 1918 to Syria, to a town called Amouda, which is right at the border between Turkey and Syria. I mean, you can stand in Amouda, which is mostly populated by Kurds today, and you could see, I could see the village where my father came from at night, the lights in Turkey. So it's that kind of situation. And the Syriacs came down along with some Muslim people from Turkey who were Kurds or other ethnic groups, and they built two major towns in the province of Hasakeh, the city of Qamishli and the city of Hasakeh. And they built trade centers that replaced the cities of Urfa and Mardin, who became now Turkey. And in these cities, with the help of the French, we had a very good relationship with the three groups: the Kurds, the Arabs, and the Syriacs. And during the democratic era, there were three representatives of Al-Hasakeh to the Syrian parliament in the period from 1932 to 1958, till before the union with Egypt. And during that time, my own father represented Al-Hasakeh as a Syriac for 23 years. So I grew up in a political home, learning about the basis of how Syria came about and was built as a country and its democratic roots. But in 1963, after the Ba'athists took over, my father and his friends who were associated with the democratic rule, became persona non grata in the country. So I grew up learning how it is to be struggling for democracy against the socialists who had taken over. And really, the socialists were trying to build a nation based on hatred or resentment. And this is what happens when you build a nation on hate and resentment. You end up with a revolution, a bloody revolution. So in 1978, I left Syria, came to the United States. In a way, I wanted to flee the persecution that my family was going through with other people, pro-democracy people. They had nationalized my father's agricultural land, although he didn't have too much land. But they had a special law that bypassed the land reform law, where they could nationalize anybody's land, regardless if he had over the quota land or not. My father didn't have too much land over the quota, but they just wanted to nationalize his land for political reason, because he was a leader in his community. So I wanted to flee all that. I came to the United States in '78 and studied civil engineering and worked here and became nationalized citizen. Didn't want to go back to Syria and didn't want to touch the political scene in Syria at all. And then my father followed me here and asked me to return to Syria, and I did return in 1993 after he passed away. And I was living very content in Syria, and I was married there. I had a family and business, and then I decided in 2003 to run for parliament. This is after the death of Hafiz al-Assad in year 2000. And year 2001, Syria, was going through what we call the Damascus Spring, where pro-democracy activists, issued documents about their vision for a new democratic Syria. I was following the situation from a distance, but I was very supportive of it, like most Syrians, actually. And, they were demanding Syria to be a democratic, civil, pluralistic country. Eventually, most of these activists, Michel Kilo and others, many of my friends, were arrested. And to give you some of the inside background, that we know as people within the opposition, it was actually Bashar al-Assad who had summoned Michel Kilo and Arif Dalila and Riyad Saif and many others to his office in Damascus and encouraged them to start the Damascus Spring. He was, in the beginning, he realized that he needed to have a change in the country, that he cannot continue to rule the way that his father has ruled. But eventually, the apparatus within his regime, and I think regional pressure from Iran as well, he had to give up on this, and he had to imprison these activists. But nevertheless, he had started the process, and imprisoning them, it even made it worse. And in 2003, I decided to run. I had no contact with the opposition at that time. And I ran in the northeast. I was living in Damascus, but I ran in Hasakeh, which was, where my family is from, where their name recognition there. And I ran a real campaign that was the first parliamentarian campaign under Bashar al-Assad after he had become president in June of 2000. And people had high hopes that in this parliamentary election, the Assad regime will allow people to actually elect their representative. So I was part of the test for that. So I had a real campaign and reached out to as many people as possible in the province of Hasakeh. I went to Kurdish villages, Arab villages, and spoke about the issues, the need to reform and have democratic reforms, and the need for changes. And many people really were very speculative about my efforts. Some very powerful, like tribal leaders, told me that they will cut their hand if I could get more than 100 votes. Because they were leaders of tribes that had, 50,000 members or 100,000 members. And here I was someone who was expat in the US and then was living now in Damascus, and nobody knows him. But I did a real campaign. And I did appeal to people that I would represent a legacy of democracy in Syria because of my father's history. So that kind of gave me an authentic advantage. And I built on that. And then when the vote was counted, I had achieved 24,400 votes. But I asked the tribal leaders, no one to cut their hands. And some of these tribal leaders who had challenged me, got about 150 votes, although they had a large tribe. So that shows that these tribal, allegiance is really not there anymore. So the Syrian people would like to have a real democracy, I think, in their country. I saw the country change drastically from year 2000. I moved there in 1993, but I saw drastic change, especially with the young people, especially recently with the internet, as they became exposed to, political realities and the political world and how people rule themselves in other places. And then I tried, after the Iran in 2003, in 2004, I started to make contacts with the Syrian opposition. And then I became involved with the Syrian Human Rights Organization. I realized from my experience in 2003 that this regime would not reform itself and that it will not change without pressure. So this is why I went to the Syrian Human Rights Organization, and then I became the director of the organization. And shortly after, the regime put me on travel ban in January of 2006. So I was not allowed to leave the country after that. I became very much acquainted with the opposition. I decided to run again in 2007. I realized the opposition, just didn't have a vision for change. They had produced the documents and, the vision as to what should New Syria look like, but they had no vision for how we are going to get there. Nobody, when I talked about revolution, demonstrations, none of them really related to that, So in 2007, I decided to run again and to use the campaign to mobilize young people in Hasaki, and to do that with whether they're Arabs or Kurds or Syriacs, just to develop a network of young people. And when I approached the Syrian opposition about my desire and vision, they discouraged me, and they thought it was useless. And I remember just few opposition people came to my campaign, offered to help, and wanted to know how much they will be paid. So they had become, like a professional opposition with no vision. And so I really decided I will focus on the young people, the apolitical people, And I remember communicating this to my friends in the U.S. And they thought it was crazy to bypass experienced opposition and to work on your own, And especially that many of those opposition figures were well known to certain organizations and people here in the United States. But I thought that the reality on the ground didn't correspond. So I worked with the young people and Kurdish people in Qamishli and Hasaki in 2007. We monitored the elections. The regime knew what I was up to, so they called me early on, and this general in Damascus, told me to go back to Hasaki and withdraw my candidacy. And I asked him why. Well, and he said, because you're not going to win. So he told me that it wasn't the right time to run, and that no one should know about this conversation, and that if anybody finds out about this conversation, he was going to be very unhappy. So I went back to Hasaki and continued my run. And we mobilized, and these young people who were with us worked with me and monitored the elections and became involved and challenged the regime and exposed the rigging of the elections In 2011, they became the Hasake Coordination Committee without any interference from me, on their own. And they called me later and said, where are you? You talked to us about democracy, you got us into this. We would like you to become an honorary member of our committee. So I think it paid off. And many of them are now very active in the revolution. But we were able to call off the election, and I clearly won the election as an independent candidate, even with by the numbers of the government. But the government decided to have a shallow list, which automatically won, and so I couldn't get my seat in the parliament, in the Syrian parliament, in 2007. And then I was waiting for them to fulfill their promise after, to fulfill their threat. So they offered me, a week later, they summoned me and offered me a loan. Very, very generous loan to build a factory, because they said you're a Syrian patriot and you have support, but in order to win, and you really need to be seen like a successful businessman. So we will arrange for you to have a loan, very with no interest. So I said, fine. I got in my car and left Hasake, drove back to Damascus. And that was my response to their offer. That was their threat, So I gave up on a loan that was like $700,000. And but they managed to marginalize me, And I used to tell my wife, like, I don't know why I have a cell phone, It just doesn't ring at all. Because anybody of my supporter who used to be in contact with me would be summoned by the Secret Service and intimidated and told why is he friend with me and that I was a U.S. agent, this sort of claims that they still do and say against the opposition, including Bashar al-Assad. So I was in that situation, unable to leave the country, like 472 others, activists. And we were marginalized, really. And we just talked to each other, opposition, travel banned people, we just had no role, really, in society to speak of until the revolution broke out on March 15, 2011. Of course, the revolution in Syria was inspired by Tunisia and Egypt, definitely. I mean, the Syrian people were ready to revolt long ago against the oppressive regime of Bashar al-Assad, We are ruled by Secret Service who interfere in every single, part of our lives. We can't be opposition, we can't criticize anything. And when the revolution broke out, it happened in Daraa. Daraa is to the south of Damascus, close to the Golan Heights. And it's an area that had a large support for the Ba'ath party, actually. Actually, that speaks into how much real support it had, the regime had. And it started with the young children in Daraa writing anti-government graffitis on the wall of their school, And then they were arrested by a cousin of the president who headed a Secret Service agency there. They were tortured. Their parents went and asked that they will be released. Then the parents were insulted. This cousin of the president didn't understand the culture in the south, which was more tribal, and insulted them very badly. and then they demonstrated. And then the regime made another mistake of firing at the demonstrators. That was pouring oil on the fire, and then the demonstrations began to spread throughout the country. And the regime tried to use two techniques in this time. In April of 2011, then they would try to make changes, political changes. They were not really deep enough to satisfy the people. So they released some political prisoners in April, and they decided to take off the emergency law, which was at that time 48 years old. And that had made little change, but not enough change to convince the people. The demonstration continued because although the president had tried to make some appeasement, it wasn't convincing. For example, he wanted to hold talks with the opposition, but the people who went to the talks were not us, the opposition. We got, they were people close to the regime, and they weren't talking about our issues. But the regime did try to reach out to people like us and have talks, but in private. Like I was, since I'm a Syria Christians, they sent a priest to me from the church who arranged for a meeting with a official, government official. And we were supposedly to discuss the situation, but I had, in that meeting, I had no chance to speak. He was speaking all the time. And then when I tried to speak one time, his version was that this was a foreign conspiracy, that these people who are, doing the demonstrations were paid people, and that they were firing at the police, Syrian police. And so I asked him, I said, Mr. General, what about the 200 medical students at Damascus University who demonstrated yesterday? That was the only statement I was allowed to make in that conversation. When I made that statement, he hit the table with his hand, and he said to me, I'm not going to ruin this country because of 200 stupid medical students. So this is their view of our top students in the country. So I could see that they were not really serious in this dialogue, and they had no real intention of doing any reform. And then I was then after this regularly summoned, and they will try to get me, at times where there are demonstrations, to see if I was involved in the demonstrations. And it was the same, they just talk and don't give you a chance to really say anything. I remember one time he asked me what were our demands, and I said, we basically want the basic individual freedoms. Again, he says, you're talking like Western. What you're asking for is Western propaganda. And so I kept pressuring him, and he finally said to me, if we give 1 inch, if we give you 1 step of reform, that means the beginning of the downfall of our regime. So, so I heard it from them. In private, in the media, they were making all these claims that they want to reform. They're having dialogue with the opposition, but us, the real opposition, we were having a different dialogue with them. And we knew that they had no intention of reform. This is why when you see in the media the regime pretending that he wants to dialogue with the opposition and he wants to negotiate, and then we appear like we are unwilling, it's because of experiences like this, which is really not in the media when the news are said. So anyway, I left Syria in in September 2011. We were 472 people travel banned. The travel ban was lifted in June of 2011. I stayed on in Syria. I didn't leave the country. And we were trying to put together a council inside of Syria for the opposition. And you know, we had attempted to do a council and announce it at the same time in July of 2011 in Syria and in Istanbul. And they found out about the location where we're going to have the meeting in Damascus. And at night, you know, we had many opposition people were protecting the building where we were supposed to have the meeting in the morning. So the security comes and open fire and kills 15 young men who were manning the building. So it was very hard to start a council inside of Syria. This gave a, you know, then we were thinking really of a council to take form outside of Syria. Because the logical thing was to have a council to represent the demands of the revolution inside the country. And many people, to this day, they don't understand why we did it outside the country, not inside the country. But the regime wasn't going to allow it. So we had a council outside the country. And it was in November 2011, the Syrian National Council was formed, and I played a role in its bringing about. And we had an experience where really we didn't have a full participation of all the political forces within the country. And that was a big problem. And we, you know, we just had a competition, basically, that who will have control over or have the most influence within the council. And basically, the Syrian expat politicians who we've never heard of in Syria, you know, just showed up and wanted to really be part of the council, and some of them wanted to be in the leadership of the council. And so I think this is one of the main reasons why the Syrian National Council was not able to succeed in bringing down the Syrian regime, because we had many Syrian expats who had no connection with the revolution and no real understanding of the regime, and who were too compromised because of their international connections to make independent decisions. So eventually, you know, they had to bypass the Syrian National Council and go to the Syrian National Coalition in November of 2012. And I was part of that, and it's the initiating meeting. But then we ran into the same problems. We were just now changing figures. And again, you know, in the first meeting, I remember the Turkish foreign minister was there, the Qatari foreign minister was there, and it was in Qatar, and it just was not authentic. You know, I am part of the Syrian opposition inside the country, and I had a colleague of mine, and we just looked and shook heads. You know, this doesn't look like our revolution inside the country. And we were really brought there to the first meeting just for, like, they had some people from the inside, we signed, and then in the second meeting, I was actually maneuvered out of the coalition. So I think this is one thing we need to back and say, you know, this revolution started as peaceful revolution. And we were wanting to overthrow the regime peacefully, like in Tunisia and in Egypt, unlike the Libyan model. You know, that was our hope. But the regime insisted on using fire against the demonstrators for a long time. We tried in the Syrian National Council to mobilize the international community to provide absorbers, first Arab absorbers, then international absorbers, so we can protect the demonstrators and hope that the demonstrations will grow. You have almost half of the Syrian population live in the two major cities, Damascus and Aleppo. And these two major cities where about 12 million of the 24 million Syrian live really never got into the demonstrations. Aleppo really never, the people, who are mostly, by the way, Sunni Muslims. They're not Christians or Druze or Kurds, you know. These people criticize the minorities for not supporting the regime, but I think what's keeping Bashar al-Assad in power, it's the majority Sunni who never joined the revolution. So they, you know, there was no ability for us to really encourage protection, provide protection for the peaceful demonstrations. Syrian military personnel started to defect. We encouraged them to become like protector of the demonstrators, and that worked because the regimes, you know, stopped firing at demonstrators when the Free Syria Army protected these demonstrations. But because of the failing of the leadership, political leadership, eventually, you know, the revolution turned into a military confrontation. We failed to really provide protection for the peaceful demonstrators, and the regime wanted to turn this into a military confrontation because it's very convicting to him if it's a popular uprising. You know, and the model for the regime was 1982 Hama, when the Muslim Brotherhood had a military uprising and he crushed it and gained control of the country. So they thought if they could turn this revolution into a military confrontation, the same mistake that the Muslim Brotherhood did in 1982, then they'll have a chance to crush it and regain control of the country. So this is the game plan of the regime. It has partially succeeded. You know, the international community and the Syrian opposition, political opposition, failed to really protect the peaceful revolution and provide protection. And this is how we ended up in the situation we are now. Also, elements in the Syrian opposition wanted to go from the beginning into a military confrontation, especially the Islamist elements. And to the, you know, there were many people in the opposition who are Muslims, you know, who didn't want the military confrontation. They wanted the continuation of the peaceful demonstrations, and they would not cooperate with the revolutionists who were carrying arms. But the regime, you know, for a long time, they were arresting people who were involved in the peaceful demonstrations, torturing them, and then releasing them after they signed a paper pledging not to demonstrate again. And most of these young men, you know, after they signed this paper, they went out and took up arms. And that was really the goal of the regime. He wanted to really turn this revolution from a popular uprising into a military confrontation. So these are, in brief, the causes. So we are now in a very peculiar situation. As someone who has been part of the Syrian opposition for many, many years, I just feel like we have lost the process, that there are so many foreign elements, whether in the political opposition or whether on the ground. And now we are seeing, we never really knew as Syrians how much Iran had influence on our country. We really never enjoyed international support. And I'm saying this as someone who is part of the close circle of the opposition in Syria, where we had dialogue with continuous dialogue with the diplomatic community. We never really had any support. I mean, some people think the US supported the revolution, or Europe, or no, we were begging them early on the first few months to support, and we just were getting all kinds of excuses. And then, you know, we, of course, have in Syria the peculiar situation that we are neighboring Israel. And that also plays a different, you know, adds a new dimension. It's different than Tunisia or Libya or Egypt. Egypt has a peace treaty with Israel. We don't. So that also had a very peculiar role in the events of our revolution, as we were having dialogue and discussions with the diplomatic representation in Syria as opposition. So this makes the Syrian situation very, very complex. It's not an easy people uprising against a dictatorship or you know, oppressive regime. It has a lot more dimension to it. But one thing is that we know now that nonviolent struggle in Syria will not end with the falling of Bashar al-Assad. You know, it will have to continue. Even very strong elements in the opposition that now we have been able to intermingle as opposition with each other and know each other, we have discovered as pro-democracy activists that there is a culture, political culture of dictatorship. It's not just the Ba'athist. I mean, this political culture is exercised across the board. And, you know, so I have tried personally in my work with the leadership of the opposition to speak up against this culture. And I've experienced something that we never did as opposition when we used to differ in views in Syria. I mean, when we used to differ in views in Syria over issues, we may yell at each other, we may scream at each other, and not talk with each other for a while. But right now, when you are of different opinion, they threaten your life. You know, so this is a new negative development in the Syrian opposition. So this is a culture that needs to be really struggled against. And I'd like to hear from you if you have any more questions.
What kind of support at that early period would have helped?
I mean, it's gone now. That opportunity is missed. But of course, that if we have had support at that time, especially on how to organize peacefully, how to empower the demonstrations, how to discourage elements who were promoting the idea of military confrontation. You know, we had international actors and regional actors like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. I mean, Turkey facilitated through its border. Saudi Arabia and Qatar provided finances. So that I think was should have been discouraged. You know, we should have worked early on encouraging the peaceful demonstrations. It took us months to get even public support from the West. You know, we met many times with many diplomats. You know, and it took a lot for them to even start making any statements of support.
So knowing what you know today, if you could go back, what would you do in the strategic planning process differently?
Well, I think we needed to prepare for the revolution earlier on. I wasn't really aware of the in-depth of the culture of the violent, you know, the culture that you respond to violence by violence, you know. And then we had the Libyan model, which became the dominant model, you know. That was harmful. Yeah, go ahead. Ladies first.
Thanks a lot for the talk. First, I'd like, of course, to ask what can be done still. Mm-hmm. Beside the, you know, we know now, listening a lot about the arming and shipping the arms to the Free Syrian Army. So what do you think can be done in nonviolent means at this position? Because it's too late to think what should have been done. And about the opposition, how can you assess, are there any, how to say, the people besides the rebels of Free Syrian Army in Syria with whom it's possible to have any kind of dialogue and have any action? And again, I would ask again, when you talk about the opposition, because when we talk about the opposition in Syria, it's very easy for the regime to tell that it's a position, but we know that opposition in the usual way in Syria didn't really exist, you know, in a way as we expected, because it was a one-party state. So when you talk about the genuine opposition in Syria, who we know you, but like how many people like you were there? Like how organized were you?
It's a long story. Well, the Syrian opposition in Syria existed, and there were many in the thousands. And of course, in 40 years of Ba'athist rule, they first started with the Nasserists. They, you know, imprisoned the Nasserists. So you have these, part of the opposition are the ultra-Arab nationalists, you know, and we call them in Arabic Hay'at al-Tansiq, and they are inside of Syria. Then came in the persecution of the communists by the Syrian regime. So like Michel Kilo and others are ex-communists. George Sabra is still a communist, you know. So these people were imprisoned for a while. Riyad al-Turk, who was like for 24 years in jail. And so you added ultra-Arab nationalists, leftists, and then the communist elements, not to mention the liberals who were really not organized. Most of them immigrated. And then you have the Muslim Brotherhood, who tried on their own to overthrow the regime in 1980, 81, 82. They lost and left. And then you have individual, independent people like me, who are liberal actually. And then you have people that I had run into by being a candidate who are actually Ba'athists, who are within the system, who came and whispered in my ear and complained. And many of these people, after the revolution, you know, split and left, defected. So there is a substantial opposition. The question is, and the failing was, how to really bring it all together. What is required, I think now at this point, is to protect the areas that have been liberated from the Syrian regime. So we need to, at this time, you have to provide military help for the Free Syria Army that is sustaining these areas, the freed area. which is they're called rebel strength. They have the blue color on the map. So these have to be protected, and hopefully, if we could have either an interim government or a civilian management by the opposition of these areas, because we have now a political opposition that is not united and has no authority over any military on the ground. So you need to establish that. He's first, yeah.
Thank you very much, sir. My preoccupation and the question would be to look at the post-Syria. And I understand by faith, looking at the look of things, that the opposition will certainly win. And if that happens, if the opposition were to succeed today, what kind of preparation is going on within the opposition to ensure that internal instability, overpower, and resource benefit do not lead to a second phase unrest within Syria, as witnessed in Libya, Iraq, and supposedly Egypt?
Well, there is a lot of attempt that has been made to study the transitional period. But we don't really have the tools to actually implement it once the regime falls. This is the problem. Like I said, we have a political opposition that is fragmented and that has no authority over any of the armed people on the ground. And I think maybe this is one of the reasons beyond the US and Russia agreement on a talk between the regime and the opposition, is how to avoid really what could go wrong after and if Assad, and when Assad falls. So there have been transitional plans, by many experts. I myself participated in one of the effort called The Day After. And there are people right now, experts working on transition plan, but I think it's all kind of early. There are other steps that need to be made before that. Assad has not fallen. It doesn't look he's going to fall soon with the way things are. I think there is a more urgent step. I spoke about protecting the liberated area, but I think the most urgent state is to have a political contract agreed upon by all the parties of the Syrian opposition. If we don't have a political contract, with this competition that is going on, fragmentation will continue. So this is, I think, is the priority, high priority.
У меня вопрос вот какой. Вы знаете, я знаю, что Путин передает режиму Асада оружие, русское оружие.
This is my question. I know that Russian President Putin is supplying Assad's regime with Russian armaments.
Я как налогоплательщик этим просто возмущена. Мне не хочется, чтобы на мои деньги, убивали мирных жителей.
As a Russian taxpayer, I'm outraged. I don't want my taxes to go towards killing civil population in Syria.
И, к сожалению, в России очень богатый опыт, как финансировались всевозможные группы людей, как им поставлялось оружие, и это всегда ни к чему хорошему не приводило. Вот в Африке были такие кампании, в других странах, в Афганистане, и это всегда было за счет моего народа.
Unfortunately, Russia knows too well how to supply arms to shady elements, and there's a long history in African countries, in Afghanistan, and unfortunately it's all done at the expense of my people.
И пока вы находитесь в изгнании, пока вы не находитесь в Сирии, не думали ли вы о том, чтобы организовать кампанию против того, чтобы Россия поставляла оружие Асаду? То есть, потому что у нас в стране говорится, что на самом деле там нету оппозиции, там есть террористы. И вот мы помогаем в борьбе с террористами. Это ложь. Ее очень сильно распространяют. Мне кажется, что нужно вести кампанию именно против того, чтобы не было оружия, русского оружия у этого Асада.
So while you're in exile, have you thought about organizing a campaign protesting Russian supply of arms to Assad's regime? Because if you look at the Russian coverage, they don't call them rebels or opposition, they call them terrorists. So the Russian people are fed this lie that you need to do this in order to combat terrorism. So how about it? Why don't you protest Russia supplying arms to the regime, killing people?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have recommended it many times to the Syrian National Council, but nothing has been done about it. طيب نعمل بالدور من عند
Commenting on the question, I think it's devastating what you just described because the signs were there and no one reacted. I mean, the international community. I think that's the worst thing about what's happening in Syria. My question is, what do you think the future scenario will be for Syria? I mean, you paint a very bleak picture. Assad doesn't look like he's moving anywhere. The opposition is fragmented. And the ones who are being devastated are the civilians. And so where's their voice? I mean, it's obvious neither side is looking out for what the civilians want or what the civilians deserve. So what do you, as a member of the opposition, who's a liberal, who's a civilian as well, think, what are you guys doing about that? And
well, that we feel that our revolution has been stolen, whether it's the international community or the regime or those who support the regime, they all wanted to get us out of the way. They wanted the popular uprising out of the way because it's a competition between all these groups, whether they are regional countries or international countries. They can't really do their thing in the presence of popular uprising where people want to have their voice heard. Nobody wants to hear our voice or the people's voice. They want to play the international political game or the regional political game. Everybody wants their influence. And this is what they're doing at this point. But I think what now looks like will happen eventually, that there will be something like what happened in Lebanon after the civil war, a Ta'if agreement, And this is what they're pushing on in Geneva too. They want to have some sort of an agreement. And the Syrian people, I think, they're waiting. Whatever the agreement is, and whenever it happens, they will again continue the civil resistance. So I feel like we need to focus on the future. Sooner or later, nonviolence resistance will be used by the Syrian people.
Thank you, Bassam, for this presentation. It was full of feelings, actually. I want to share with you my attitude towards what's going on in Syria. Actually, for the last few months, it has been very difficult for me to have one clear opinion regarding what's going on in Syria. Being a revolutionary myself, I strongly stress the right of the Syrian people to be free and to get rid of dictatorship. And I even stress that Bashar al-Assad is a dictator much worse than Ben Ali that we ever through. But also at the same time, when we saw events in the last few months with all those weapons across the country, and you said that with this fragmented opposition, maybe it would be difficult for you to have control over all those groups, those armed groups in the country. I want to ask you about how do you think, or how do you view the future? Don't you see that you are going in a way or another to a scenario which looks different from the Libyan scenario, but actually it's the same, with all those weapons across the country, and the danger of those weapons on any future operation of democratization or whatever in the country. Thank you.
Well, I think what I have learned, even from the Tunisian experience and Egyptian, that this is a long process. This is not just a revolution that overthrow a ruler and we're done. You know, we need to have a political culture change, and that will take time, whether it's in Tunisia or in Syria, whatever happens. So we have to brace ourselves. Well, people have to try this route, you know, the weapon route, and they have to come to their own conclusion about this. You know, we can't just preach it to them.
Thank you so much for weighing in with all of your thoughts here. And you know, certainly as somebody who's paid very close attention to the way this whole thing is unfolded, when I reflect back to Dan's question about, you know, what could have been different at the beginning that could have avoided this path, to me, the one resource that nobody was able to give the Syrian opposition was time. And in my sense, you know, if the thing had had 2 years to play out, the opposition could have kind of coalesced, could have come together. But as soon as there were international actors that were providing direct support to either side, it was very difficult for, you know, time was running out very quickly. And so for me, imagining a scenario where, say, the international community did come in on the side of the opposition earlier is just imagining a situation where that window of opportunity would have closed even faster because of the nature of the regime's response and the way that that then created just different groups of armed actors on the ground. So, I mean, for me, the external support is precisely what made the movement become more violent more quickly, right? So in that sense, in a way, it contradicts your claim that international support needed to come more quickly. So I'm just going to ask you, I guess, to respond to that notion. Do you think that actually the international support was the missing factor, or do you think that the international community should have been trying to buy more time for the opposition?
Yeah, when I spoke about international support, I did not mean the regional support that was in the wrong direction. That you spoke. I had a separation in my mind, and maybe this was not clear to you. But I think that when I was talking about the international support, I was thinking of the West. And then when the regional support came from Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, was in the wrong format. Okay.
Thank you. My question is about the liberated areas, about who rules them, and whether there is any liberated space for women in those liberated areas. Because I remember that a few months ago, it transpired in the media that the so-called liberators controlled the supply of flour, and that they confiscated it all and then resold it at very high prices. So that kind of thing, I'm afraid, raises the question of whether it is possible for women who feed their families to make their voices heard in those liberated areas.
Well, when we say liberated, we mean liberated from the Assad regime. We don't mean liberated socially in the terms you are talking about. And many of these groups need to raise money and survive. These are people who have left their job. They have no source of income. So they have all these unlawful ways or moral ways of raising funds. One more?
Yeah, sorry, one more question. We're going to finish a bit early.
So, well, I didn't take any questions from this side, so we. Samara?
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story, and I agree it's really full of emotion and very heartbreaking. I said thank you for sharing your story. It's really heartbreaking to hear what has happened, and I think it's giving me a lot better picture of what's going on. And you spoke a lot about failure of the international community to support. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of the United Nations early on, and if you felt like they were really dialoguing with the opposition as well, and if you think that there was more that could have been done, or what you think can be done now by the UN to support.
Well, what we have seen of the UN during this conflict is that it's really in the hand of the members of the general security, you know. If there is no agreement among the main players, it will be ineffective. It's not very serious body. This is how it comes across. So I think Geneva too, and a direct negotiation with the regime, with the presence of the major actors like Russia, US, and Iran is more practical and pragmatic. UN is just a final stamp, of sort when they agree on something. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm very sorry.
Bassam, will you be at lunch with us?
Yes, yeah.
Ah, very
fantastic.
good.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.